Talk to yourself like this for 3 days and watch your life change. There comes a time in every life when the noise quiets and the questions grow louder. Not the everyday questions about schedules or errands, but the ones we've spent decades too busy to ask. Did I matter? Did I leave something good behind? Will I be remembered for how I made people feel, or just for the things I did? In a world that moves faster with each passing year, we often forget that legacy isn't loud. It isn't about applause. It isn't something you earn. It's something you leave behind in the silence, in the spaces between your words, in the way your presence made someone else feel seen, safe, or softened. And if that stirs something inside you, then this video was made for you. What you're about to witness isn't just information, it's a meditation, a reflection. A quietly powerful journey through ancient Buddhist insights and real-life stories. Stories of ordinary people who discovered that the most extraordinary legacy is the one carried not in books or monuments, but in breath, in compassion, and in the courage to speak kindly to oneself as the years go by. We invite you not just to watch, but to feel, to pause, to remember. This video holds lessons that unfold slowly, like petals in the morning, so I encourage you, stay with us until the final word. Somewhere in the next few minutes, you may just meet a version of yourself you forgot you were becoming. And when you do, I hope you'll take a moment to let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, share your thoughts, not for the algorithm, but because your presence here, your voice, adds to the quiet legacy we're all writing together. Chapter 1: The Voice That Ages With You, Listening to the Self You've Grown With. Have you noticed how the voice inside your head has aged with you? Not the voice you use in conversation, but the quiet one. The one that sighs softly at night, that speaks volumes in silence, that emerges when no one else is around. As we grow older, we pay close attention to our physical well-being, diet, medicine, blood pressure, the stiffness of our knees in winter. But almost no one teaches us how to care for the way we speak to ourselves. That voice inside, it hasn't grown tired, it hasn't softened naturally. If anything, it often becomes more critical with age. It turns into a litany of self-judgment. I should have done more. Why didn't I take that chance? It's too late now. In Buddhist philosophy, this is the unfolding of karma, not in the mystical sense of reward and punishment, but in the deeply human experience of habit. Every thought, every belief, every internal whisper is a seed. And those seeds take root. The seeds of self-judgment grow into the trees of withdrawal, while seeds of kindness blossom into courage. Let me tell you about George, 73, retired, kind eyes, quiet demeanor. At a retreat in Oregon, I asked participants to write down a phrase they often repeat internally. George took his time. Eventually, he scribbled something down and folded the paper. Later, under a tree outside the meditation hall, he opened it and showed me, "I'm useless now." It wasn't said with sorrow, it was casual, as if describing the weather. He told me he thought it every morning, right after waking. And again, whenever he realized he hadn't spoken to anyone that day. It was a thread, repeated so often that it had woven itself into his sense of being. His voice didn't shout. It whispered until it became the wallpaper of his days. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha said, all that we are is the result of what we have thought. Karma, then, is not something outside us. It is our own inner narrative repeated until believed, and belief shapes posture, voice, life. In one of the Jataka tales, the Buddha once told a story of a man who believed he was worthless after losing everything. When he met a wise monk, the monk simply asked him to sit by a tree and offer kind words to himself daily for 7 days. By the end of the week, the man had not regained his possessions, but he had rediscovered his dignity. This is the nature of internal alchemy. It transforms the unseen, but George didn't stay there. One morning, after noble silence, he looked different, lighter. I asked him why. He said, "This morning," I whispered, "I still have stories in me." It felt silly, but also warm, a small shift. But that day he went to a local library to read to children, not to feel useful, but to be near laughter again. This is the work of inner speech, not affirmation, not denial, but subtle revision. You don't have to believe it fully. You only have to begin. Let me tell you about Lian, 84, Vietnamese American, eyes like wells of deep water. She grew up in a strict home, survived war and exile, and carried decades of inner criticism. For most of her life, her inner voice was that of her mother, stern, unyielding. But one day, Lian said, "I started speaking to myself the way I wish she had." She began painting, not for galleries, just for herself, flowers, rivers. Light, her home filled with quiet joy. The shift, it wasn't external, it was how she spoke to herself in the silence. In her words, she was no longer an aging woman waiting for the end. She was a blossoming soul returning home. Buddhism teaches that the mind is like a field. What we plant, we grow, but we must choose what to plant. If you plant thorns, do not expect roses. If you plant compassion, you will walk softer paths. There are 3 sacred thresholds we cross each day, subtle, often unnoticed, yet rich with possibility. The first is the moment we awaken. In that sliver of time, the mind is still tender, like untouched snow. It hasn't yet remembered what the world demands. That is the moment to plant something kind. A sentence, a thought, a whisper that leans toward life, not a performance, not a productivity chant. Just something like, "May I begin gently today." The second moment arises when fatigue arrives. Not exhaustion, not collapse, but that honest weariness that shows up halfway through the day, the kind that reveals our vulnerability. That's when the inner critic sharpens, when we're most tempted to say, "I'm failing," or "I'm falling behind." But this is the precise moment when compassion must rise. Whisper instead, "I am allowed to be tired. I am allowed to rest." And the third moment comes just before sleep, when the lights dim, when the world quiets, when our thoughts prepare to soften into dream. The mind is open again, receptive. Let it close not with judgment, but with kindness. Say to yourself, "I made it through. I showed up. I'm still here." These are not mantras to be forced, not declarations etched in stone. They are gentle offerings, blessings, like warm tea left for the soul. Speak them softly. Believe them slowly. In the Tibetan tradition, there is a saying, "The words we whisper into ourselves become the winds that carry our karma forward." If this is true, then why not make those winds gentle? Why not offer our future selves something soft to ride upon? Zen has always reminded us, do not seek the Buddha outside. The true refuge is within. Your own voice, when tempered by compassion, can be the lantern that lights your darkest night. So here is a practice for tonight. Before you sleep, find a quiet moment. Place your hand upon your heart, not as a ritual, but as a recognition. And ask gently, what did I tell myself today? Was it rooted in truth? Did it carry kindness? Was it of any real help? If the answer is no, then release it. No scolding, no shame, just release. And in its place, offer one sentence that feels like kindness, even if it feels strange on your tongue. Even if it trembles with uncertainty, let it be enough, because repetition is how we remember, and what we remember we become. As Thich NH letter 1EA5T H letter 1EA1NH once said so beautifully, with each breath we are planting seeds. So what seeds have you planted today? You are still breathing, you are still unfolding, and that alone is miracle enough. Let your inner voice become your oldest and most loyal friend. The companion who stays, who softens, who does not abandon you no matter how many seasons pass. Because in the end it will be that voice, the one shaped by mercy and love, that walks you to your final breath, and may that breath be tender. Always. Chapter 2, The Echoes We Carry, Healing the Voice of the Past. As we step into the later chapters of our lives, we begin to hear echoes more clearly, not just the ones from outside, but the ones within. The voice that comments on your reflection, that mutters quietly in the stillness, often carries the inflections of the past. A mother's scolding, a teacher's disapproval, a lover's silence. These tones stay with us longer than we realize. They become internalized, etched into the rhythm of our inner speech like grooves in an old record. One of the great teachings of Buddhism reminds us that the present is not merely a point in time, it is an intersection. The present moment holds within it all the seeds of the past and all the fruit of the future. When our inner voice speaks, it draws not only from today but from yesterday's sorrow, yesterday's fear, yesterday's unloved child. But here is the mercy in the Dharma. If our suffering has a cause, then our healing can have a path. I remember meeting a woman named Dorothy at a retreat in Oregon. She was 68, a retired social worker with a warm smile and eyes that looked like they had weathered many storms. She told me, "I hear my father's voice more now than I ever did when he was alive." Her father had been a stern man, distant, always correcting, never praising, and though he had been gone for over 20 years, his tone still lived inside her. When she dropped something, she'd mutter, "So clumsy." When she forgot something, "Useless." These weren't her own judgments, they were inherited scripts, passed down like old furniture, worn and familiar. "Sometimes," she said, "I wonder if I ever got to hear my own voice." We sat in silence for a while, then I asked her, "If you could speak to the little girl inside you, the one who first heard those words, what would you say?" She paused, her eyes welled up, and then she whispered, "I would say, you are more than what he saw, you are not broken, you are blooming." That sentence changed something in her. Slowly, she began to replace the inherited voice with her own, not overnight, but moment by moment, breath by breath. This is the path of inner reparenting, a practice not only of self-compassion but of reclamation. It is the act of becoming the wise elder you never had, the loving parent your younger self needed. The compassionate voice that was once missing, now reborn within. Buddhist practice does not ask us to forget the past. It asks us to transform our relationship with it, to bow to it but not to be bound by it. In the words of the Buddha, just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past over and over again. But how do we begin this shedding? First, by noticing. Awareness is the first step of liberation. Begin to observe the tone of your inner voice. Is it harsh? Is it rushed? Does it carry old weight? Second, by naming. Give that voice a shape, a story. When you hear the old criticism rise, say, "Ah, that's my father's voice," or "That's the voice of fear I learned in school." Naming creates distance, and in that distance, choice is born. Third, by choosing a new tone. This is not about erasing the past, but about rebalancing it. For every harsh word, offer a kind one. For every judgment, offer an embrace. For every "you can't," offer a gentle "you are trying." I once asked a room full of elders, what phrase would you most want to hear from yourself every day? The answers were simple, honest, sacred. "You did enough today. You are safe now. I'm proud of you." None of these are extravagant, they are the soul's daily bread. Let's not forget, in Buddhism, the tongue is considered one of the sense bases, not only for speech but for karma. The words we speak to others and to ourselves are part of our ethical fabric. They either bind us or free us. So why not speak gently? There's a tale from the Jataka stories, accounts of the Buddha's past lives, where a bodhisattva was born as a parrot. When a forest fire erupted, the parrot tried to save the burning creatures by soaking its wings in water and flapping drops over the blaze. The gods watched, amused at the futility. But one deity, moved by the bird's compassion, transformed into rain and quenched the fire. Sometimes our kind words feel like tiny drops over wild flames, but spoken consistently, with sincerity, they invite grace. They transform the landscape of our mind. Tonight, before bed, ask yourself, whose voice have I been carrying today? Then gently ask, is it time to set it down? And when you wake, let your first words not be a to-do list or a judgment. Let them be a welcome, a homecoming. a simple, silent blessing. I am here, and I will listen with love. This is how we begin to heal the echoes, not with force, not with denial, but with the softness of presence. Because the voice inside you is listening, and it is longing to be loved. Chapter 3: The Mirror of Mindfulness, Transforming Inner Dialogue Through Presence. There comes a time in each life when silence begins to reveal more than words ever did. Not the awkward silence of a conversation gone stale, nor the heavy silence of loneliness, but the sacred silence that opens when we stop running from ourselves. In that stillness, what do we hear? Often, the first thing that echoes is our own inner voice, and for many, that voice is not kind. It replays old scripts, regrets, unmet expectations, and the unspoken ache of all the should-haves. But here lies a gentle truth. Mindfulness is not about silencing that voice. It is about listening to it with fresh ears, ears softened by compassion. Because the voice inside us does not need to be silenced, it needs to be understood. The Buddha once taught that the mind is like a mirror. When dust settles on it, we cannot see clearly, not the world and not ourselves. But mindfulness is the gentle act of wiping the mirror, of seeing what's really there without turning away. Let me share the story of Marjorie, a woman of 81 who came to one of our sanghas in Oregon. Marjorie had a sharp wit, crisp white hair, and eyes that had seen sorrow but had not surrendered to it. One evening during our closing circle, she confessed, "I spent most of my life being useful. Now that I'm not needed as a mother or wife or employee, I feel like a ghost in my own home." There was a pause, and then, with her eyes fixed on the candle in the center of the room, she added, "But lately, when I sit in meditation, I see something different. I see that I'm not the roles I played, I'm the awareness that witnessed them." That is the gift of presence. It allows us to step back, not to detach, but to deepen, to realize that we are not just the narrator of our lives, we are the silent witness beneath the narration. Marjorie began to change, not outwardly, but inwardly. She stopped apologizing for resting. She spent mornings sketching the birds from her kitchen window, not to achieve anything, but simply to see. She began each day with a sentence she whispered like a prayer, "I am more than what I do." This too is a Dharma gate. Mindfulness is often misunderstood as merely paying attention. But in Buddhism, mindfulness, sati, is the art of remembering, not remembering past events, but remembering our true nature, our Buddha nature. When the voice inside becomes harsh, mindfulness helps us pause, to inquire. To ask, is this thought helping me awaken, or is it a relic of fear, shame, or conditioning? And in that pause, transformation begins. There is an old Zen saying, "When the mind is nowhere, it is everywhere." In our later years, the temptation to live in the past or worry about the future is strong, but mindfulness invites us to return to now, not as an escape, but as a refuge. The present moment is not just where life happens. It is where healing happens. Here's a practice. Each morning before you reach for your phone or turn on the news, take 1 minute, just one. Sit with your breath, hand on heart, feet on floor. Say silently, "May I meet myself gently today." And each time you catch the inner voice slipping into old grooves, "I should have," "It's too late to," "I'll never be," greet it not with judgment, but with curiosity. Ask, whose voice is this really? Often we find that the harshest voices do not even belong to us. They are echoes of culture, family, past pain, and once seen, they can be softened. Let us recall the story of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of compassion. It is said that she listens deeply to the cries of the world, but what many forget is that she also listens deeply to the cries within. And we must do the same. To age in mindfulness is to become more intimate with the present, to shed the armor of proving and rest in the sanctuary of being, to discover that our worth was never in our usefulness, but in our presence. Let your presence be the medicine. let your breath be the bridge, and let your inner voice grow quiet enough to hear the deeper song beneath it, the song of your own sacred becoming. This is the path, this is the practice. And you, beloved one, are not late, you are right on time. Chapter 4, The Garden of Compassion, Cultivating Inner Warmth in the Autumn of Life. There's a season in the heart that mirrors late autumn, a time of release, reflection, and quiet beauty. It is a time when the winds of change no longer startle us but move through us like old friends. For those of us who have journeyed through decades of living, loving, and loss, this season can become sacred if we know how to tend its garden. Compassion in the Buddhist tradition is not merely an emotion, it is a practice. A training of the heart to stay open, especially when it would be easier to close. When we are young, we are taught to be kind to others. Say thank you, share your toys, don't hurt your brother. But few of us are taught how to be kind to ourselves, especially when we fall short, grow older, or face the quiet ache of irrelevance. But the Buddha was clear, we cannot pour from an empty cup. And no act of compassion offered to the world is complete if it does not include ourselves. Let me tell you about Grace. She was 76 when she first sat in the temple garden beside me, her hands trembling as she tied a string of prayer flags. She had spent years caregiving for her husband as Alzheimer's slowly erased his memory. She had been strong, dutiful, and endlessly patient. But when he passed, she didn't know what to do with all that love she had been pouring into him. "I feel like a pitcher with no cup to fill," she said one afternoon. We sat together in silence. I gently offered her a practice to turn her loving kindness inward, each morning before rising to whisper 3 simple phrases. May I be gentle with myself, may I find peace in this moment, may I remember that love does not end, it transforms. At first she wept. It feels selfish, she said, but over time something softened, her voice grew less brittle. She started painting cards and sending them to other widows in her neighborhood. She found new ways to pour the same love, but from a well that now included herself. This is the quiet revolution of compassion. It begins not with grand gestures, but with a change in tone, a softening of gaze, a willingness to see our own suffering not as shameful, but as sacred. In the Dhammapada it is written, hatred does not cease by hatred. It ceases by love. This is the eternal law, and this law applies within as well. The hatred we carry for our aging bodies, our past mistakes, our unmet expectations, it can only be healed by love, so we begin with small acts. We touch our own hand with kindness. We rest when we are tired, not when everything is done. We forgive ourselves, not because we've earned it, but because it is the only way to be whole. There is a Zen story of a monk who, after decades of striving to reach enlightenment, gave up and went to tend the monastery garden. He raked the leaves, swept the paths, and watered the flowers. One day, while gently brushing dust from a lotus leaf, he felt a deep stillness settle in his chest. He realized in that moment, the compassion he had been searching for had always been in the way he held his broom, the way he bowed to the earth, the way he forgave the weeds for growing. Compassion is not found in transcendence, it is found in presence, and the most tender presence is often born in the shadow of grief, regret, or uncertainty. Here is a daily practice. Before you eat, pause. Look at your meal not as a task, but as a blessing. Say silently, may this nourish me. May I eat with gratitude and gentleness. May I offer kindness to the one who receives this food, me. It seems small, but over time these rituals become roots, and those roots can anchor us even when everything else feels adrift. The elderly woman in the lotus posture is not practicing to escape age, she is practicing to become its friend. In the Mahayana tradition, we speak of the Bodhisattva Kshitigarbha, the guardian of beings in suffering. But his name also means earth store, one who holds compassion like the soil holds seeds, patiently waiting for them to bloom. You too are an earth store. Every breath you meet with compassion becomes a blossom. Every wrinkle you greet with tenderness becomes a petal. Every self-critical thought you replace with kindness becomes sunlight. Let your inner garden grow wild with grace. Let it be a refuge, not just for others, but for the precious soul that lives behind your own eyes. Because the voice of compassion, the one that says it's okay, you are enough, I see you, that voice is the true spiritual teacher. And that teacher lives inside you. Let us continue this path together, not seeking perfection but presence, not chasing purpose but becoming peace. This is the garden, this is the season, and you are already blooming. Chapter 5: The Mirror and the Moon, Seeing Yourself with New Eyes. There's a moment in every aging soul's journey when a mirror becomes more than a mirror, it becomes a kind of oracle. It reflects not just lines and creases, but seasons of living. Each wrinkle becomes a chapter. Each softening around the eyes, a verse in the long poem of your becoming. But we rarely look with reverence. More often, we glance with judgment. I look tired, we think, I've let myself go. And even worse, that person isn't me anymore. But the Buddha taught that all things are impermanent, and that includes your reflection. It is not fixed, it is not you. It is a momentary ripple, like the moon reflected in still water, beautiful, yes, but not the moon itself. When we cling to who we were, we suffer. When we resist who we are becoming, we suffer. But when we gaze upon our reflection with soft eyes and say, "Ah, this too is me," something releases. There's a woman I knew named Marable. At 68, she had survived breast cancer, raised 4 children, and buried 2 siblings. She had walked through fire and come out the other side, quieter but unburned. Yet when I asked her what she saw in the mirror, she said, "A stranger who looks a bit like my mother." I invited her to try something, each morning before brushing her teeth, to look into her own eyes and whisper, "I'm here, I see you." At first, she told me it felt absurd, but after 2 weeks, she said her own reflection began to feel less like a stranger and more like a companion. I started to see someone who's lived a full life, someone who made it, someone worth greeting. This is the shift from critique to companionship, from aversion to affection. In the Lotus Sutra, there is a story of a lost traveler who carries a precious jewel sewn into the lining of his robe, completely unaware. For years, he lives in poverty, searching for sustenance, never realizing he already possesses immense wealth. The jewel, of course, is our Buddha nature, and the robe, it's this aging body. Wrinkled, worn, perhaps a little sagged in the shoulders, but still containing the sacred. When you look at yourself, look for the jewel. Try this: instead of asking, "Do I look okay?" ask, "Can I see my kindness?" Can you see the forgiveness in your jawline, the strength in your brow, the softness in your smile that was carved by decades of holding others through their pain? This is not delusion. This is Dharma, because what you focus on, you amplify. And when you meet your gaze with love, your whole being softens in response. There's a saying from the Japanese Zen tradition: the moon does not fight the darkness, it simply shines. You don't need to resist the changes you see. You only need to witness them with presence. Aging is not the erosion of beauty, it is the unveiling of depth. The young may glow, but the elder radiates. The young may dazzle, but the elder warms. And while the world may not always honor the lines on your face, you can, because each one was earned. Each one holds a memory. Each one says, "I lived, I loved, I stayed." So here is a reflection practice. Stand before the mirror. Not to fix, not to scrutinize, but to be with yourself. Place a hand gently on your heart. Breathe, whisper, "I forgive the harshness I've held toward this face. I welcome the changes that life has written on me. I honor this body as my temple, my teacher, and my home." Let tears come if they must. Let silence follow if it will, because sometimes silence is how the soul says, "Thank you." In the end, the mirror will keep showing you your shape. But how you see it, that is the practice. Let each glance become a blessing. Let each wrinkle become a verse. Let each breath in front of that mirror remind you the moon still rises, the jewel still shines. And you are still worthy of your own gaze, because the true gift of aging is not in hiding from the mirror, but in learning to bow to it, with eyes of love, with a heart wide open, and with a spirit that knows this too is holy. Chapter 6: The Gentle Weight of Time, Letting Go Without Losing Yourself. As we grow older, we begin to understand that life is not just about accumulation, it is about release. Slowly, gently, life invites us to lay things down. This letting go is not defeat, it is a form of grace. In the teachings of the Buddha, there is no greater peace than the peace that comes from relinquishing clinging, from loosening our grip on what no longer serves the heart. Letting go is not a gesture of weakness, it is a doorway to deeper freedom. In our youth we chase, we gather, we build, we strive. We wear identities like layers of clothing, professional titles, family roles, achievements, ambitions. But the longer we live, the more we begin to feel the quiet invitation beneath it all. To let go not out of failure, but because it is time. There's a woman I knew named Margaret. She had spent decades organizing family holidays, holding together the rituals of a big, noisy household. But now her children were spread across states, busy with lives of their own. One winter, after lighting a candle on her kitchen table, she told me with a tremble in her voice, "I miss being needed." I looked at her and said, "Perhaps it's not that you're no longer needed, but that your presence is becoming more subtle, like the warmth in the room after the fire has burned down." There's a phrase in Zen: do not chase the moon reflected in water. As we age, chasing fades, stillness arrives, but stillness is not emptiness. It is clarity. It is learning to love the reflection just as it is, without trying to possess it. Letting go in this sense is not abandonment. It is an act of devotion to the truth, to change, to impermanence. It is sitting with your own aging face in the mirror and saying, "You are still here, and I bow to all you have carried." The Buddha taught that everything arises and passes away, but he also taught that nothing truly disappears, it simply transforms. The you that once ran after deadlines and validation now offers quiet wisdom, a steadier gaze, a slower breath. The roles you once filled may fall away, but the awareness that lived beneath those roles remains untouched. One monk once told me, "The simpler the life, the more radiant the heart." Simplicity is not poverty. It is richness without clutter. It is finding sacredness in folding the laundry, in sipping tea slowly, in blessing your morning walks with gratitude instead of distraction. This too is letting go, not just of possessions, but of the need to be anything other than fully present. There's a kind of identity we hold in our minds. I am the caregiver. I am the provider. I am the one people turn to. But what happens when those patterns shift, when no one calls every day, when the doorbell rings less often? In Buddhist psychology, we explore the truth of anatta, non-self, not as erasure, but as freedom. You are not the roles, you are not your stories. You are awareness itself, the quiet witness that has always been there through every chapter. When those identities dissolve, what remains is not loss, but essence. I remember visiting a temple in Kyoto where a nun in her 80s spent her days tending a single garden. She said to me, "I used to be a nurse, then a mother, then a widow, now I am no one, and in that I feel closest to the Dharma." The most profound peace often comes when we are willing to let go of who we think we must be. When we place our trust in the unfolding rather than the controlling. When we open our hands, we discover they were never empty, just too full to receive. Letting go can be quiet. It might not look dramatic. It might simply be closing a chapter in your heart, putting away old regrets, forgiving yourself for not knowing what you didn't know back then, or even allowing a new joy to enter without guilt. There's a practice I offer those who are entering this stage of life. Sit with a bowl in your lap. Imagine it holds all your assumptions, roles, attachments. One by one, name them. Then, with a small tilt of the bowl, offer them back to the earth. Not because they were wrong, but because their time has passed. You do not lose yourself by releasing these things. You meet yourself more fully. You meet the self that doesn't need applause, the self that doesn't need to prove anything. The self that simply is. As we soften into this truth, we begin to live from a deeper place, not the surface of things, but the root, not the doing, but the being. The teachings remind us a full cup cannot receive. But an empty cup is always ready. So today, may you be like that empty cup, not broken, not discarded, but open. May you find the courage to release with love, to bow to all that has shaped you and say, thank you. And as you do, may you hear the quiet blessing that was always there, waiting beneath the noise. You are not what you've lost. You are not your fading roles. You are not your past. You are presence. You are breath. You are becoming. And that is enough. Letting go is not the end. It is the beginning of walking lighter, with your heart free to notice the beauty still rising all around you. Chapter 7, The Compass Within, Letting Inner Wisdom Light the Way. There comes a moment in every life, often quiet and unannounced, when we realize that the most trustworthy guidance is not outside of us. It does not come from the news, the neighbors, the past, or even the well-meaning voices of family. It comes from the still, quiet knowing within. The older we get, the more we are invited to listen to that compass. The Buddha once said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." He was not asking us to reject the world, but to recognize that our deepest wisdom does not come from clinging to others. It comes from lighting our own way, moment by moment, breath by breath. As a young monk, I once asked an elder teacher, "How will I know if I'm on the right path?" He smiled and said, "When your breath feels like home and your choices don't need applause." There's great power in that simplicity, when we no longer need to be praised to feel worthy, when we are no longer ruled by the chase for approval, when we allow our actions to rise from a place of inner clarity rather than outer pressure. This kind of living is not loud, it is not dramatic, it often looks like stillness, like kindness without performance, like boundaries without resentment, like choosing quiet over proving. One woman I knew, Helen, once told me how she had spent years trying to please everyone, her children, her friends, her church. She said, "It was like I was always backstage, helping everyone else shine, but never standing in the light myself." But one day she stopped. She began each morning with 5 minutes of silence. She would ask herself, "What do I need to hear today that no one else can tell me?" And slowly her inner voice returned. She began to write poetry. She declined invitations that felt draining. She said no without apology, not from anger, but from alignment. She told me I thought saying no was selfish, but now I see it's how I make space for what matters most. This is what it means to follow the compass within, to trust that our value is not in how much we do for others, but in how fully we honor the truth that lives quietly inside. In Buddhist teachings, we often speak of the middle way, a path between extremes, not too rigid, not too loose, not self-denial, not self-indulgence. The middle way is not found in theory, it is felt through practice, through listening. The inner compass is not a loud shout, it is a whisper that grows louder the more you trust it. It is the gentle nudge that says, "Rest now." The quiet encouragement that says, "You don't need to fix everything." The soft assurance that reminds you, you are allowed to change your mind. For many of us over 50, this journey toward inner guidance can feel new. After decades of living for others, it can feel unfamiliar to ask ourselves what we truly want. But this is not selfishness, it is soulfulness. The Buddha taught that wise speech is one of the cornerstones of the Eightfold Path, and wise speech begins not with our words to others, but with the words we say to ourselves. Ask yourself, is my inner dialogue kind? Is it honest? Is it necessary? If not, it is never too late to change the script. There is a meditation I often share. Sit quietly, place your hand on your heart, and ask, what is one truth I have been ignoring? Not to judge yourself, but to come home to yourself. Sometimes the answer is a whisper. Sometimes it arrives as an image, a memory, or even a tear, but it always brings you closer to your own center. You don't need to be perfect to listen deeply. You just need to be willing to pause, willing to feel, willing to follow where the silence leads. Your inner compass is not a destination. It is a way of moving through the world with integrity and peace. It is the practice of living in alignment with what is most real within you, and in that space, life becomes less about achievement and more about authenticity. Less about control, more about connection. The world may never fully understand your quiet courage, but your body will feel it, your spirit will rest in it, and your breath, that sacred, invisible thread, will know it has come home. Let your life be guided not by what is urgent, but by what is true. And may each step you take be a blessing, not because the world applauds, but because your heart says, yes, this is the way. The compass is within. And it has been waiting patiently for you to trust it again. Chapter 8, The Sacred Pause, Rediscovering Balance in a World that Pushes. There's a quiet power in pausing, a sacredness in the space between action and reaction. Yet so few of us are taught to honor it. From a young age, we are conditioned to keep moving, to keep doing, to keep achieving. Even in our later years, this habit lingers. We feel guilty resting. We apologize for slowing down. We judge ourselves for no longer being productive. But the Dharma teaches something radically different. That stillness is not laziness, and slowness is not failure. In fact, in the pause, we meet ourselves most honestly. It is in the silence between breaths that wisdom often arrives. When the Buddha left the palace in search of truth, he did not find it in constant striving. He found it beneath the Bodhi tree, sitting in stillness. He stopped running. He sat with discomfort, and in doing so, he awakened. We too are invited to sit with our lives, to pause before answering, to breathe before deciding, to feel before reacting. This is not weakness, it is mindfulness, and mindfulness is not reserved for monasteries. It lives in your kitchen, your garden, your morning walk. I once met a retired teacher named Thomas who shared that after 40 years of teaching, he couldn't sit still without feeling useless. If I'm not helping someone, he said, what's the point? But over time, through the practice of mindful breathing, he began to discover the sacredness of simply being. I learned, he said, that I am not a machine, I am a soul. And my worth does not depend on constant output. In Buddhism, we call this awareness of the present moment sati, a presence that is alert, compassionate, and clear. Sati is cultivated not by rushing, but by pausing, by noticing. By allowing. The sacred pause is the moment when you close your eyes and feel the warmth of the sun on your face without needing to capture it. It's the breath you take before speaking when emotions run high. It's the moment you hold your own heart with kindness instead of criticism. For those of us in the second half of life, this practice becomes even more vital. Our pace may change, our responsibilities may shift. But our inner life deepens, and it is in the pause that we truly begin to listen to that inner life. There's a story of a monk who was asked how he found peace. He replied, when I eat, I eat. When I walk, I walk. When I sit, I sit. Simple words, but within them lies a profound truth. Peace is not something we find later. It is something we create now by how we move through this moment. Imagine what would change if, instead of rushing through your days, you honored each moment as sacred. If instead of multitasking, you allowed yourself to be fully present. If you gave yourself permission to rest, not as a reward, but as a birthright. There is nothing indulgent about rest. In fact, in many ways, rest is resistance, a quiet revolution against a culture that measures worth by exhaustion. Rest is how we remember our humanity. The next time you find yourself feeling behind, ask, who told me I need to hurry? Who benefits from my burnout? And what would it feel like to stop, breathe, just breathe? Let this be your prayer. I am not behind. I am not failing. I am here. And that is enough. In the sacred pause, the noise of the world fades and the voice of your own heart becomes audible again. This is where wisdom lives, this is where balance returns, and this is where, slowly and gently, you remember you are not here to race. You are here to live. Chapter 9: The Soft Answer, Practicing Inner Kindness in a Harsh World. We live in a world that often demands answers, speed, certainty, and strength. But the Dharma invites us to offer something else, something quieter, deeper, and far more transformative, a soft answer, not just to others, but to ourselves. Especially to ourselves. As we age, many of us carry a lifetime of harsh inner judgments. We replay old mistakes. We regret words we did or didn't say. We hold tight to the should-haves and what-ifs. And over time, the voice inside grows heavy. It stops being a companion and becomes a critic. But the path of awakening asks us to soften that voice, to replace condemnation with compassion. To speak to ourselves as a loving teacher would speak to a beloved student. The Buddha once said, "You yourself, as much as anyone in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." These words are not a luxury, they are a practice. A discipline of tenderness. Let me tell you about Marjorie, a woman I once met at a retreat in Oregon. She was in her late 70s and had just lost her partner of 50 years. She came to the retreat wrapped in grief, her eyes tired, her posture drawn inward. During a session on metta or loving kindness, I guided the group to repeat the phrases, "May I be safe, may I be peaceful, may I be kind to myself." Marjorie wept. Afterward, she came to me and said, "I realized I haven't said anything kind to myself in over a decade." That moment was not weakness, it was breakthrough. It was the beginning of a new way of being. Because the truth is, self-kindness is not selfish. It is necessary. It is how we stop the chain of suffering that has passed from generation to generation, from mother to daughter, from father to son, from our culture to our hearts. Kindness is not sentimental, it is fierce. It is the strength to hold pain without tightening. It is the courage to say, "I made a mistake and I am still worthy." Buddhist psychology teaches us that the mind is like a garden. What we water grows. If we constantly water shame, resentment, and judgment, that is what will thrive. But if we choose, even for a few moments a day, to water self-kindness, then slowly, something different begins to bloom. Marjorie began a practice of placing one hand over her heart each morning and whispering, "I am still learning, I am still becoming." Simple words, soft words, but over time they reshaped her. She began to walk taller. She joined a book club. She planted a vegetable garden in her backyard, not to impress anyone, but simply to feel the miracle of life unfolding again. Kindness turned her grief into gratitude. Not by erasing the loss, but by giving her a way to live with it. In a world that often feels too fast, too loud, too cruel, the soft answer is a radical act. It says, "I will not continue the violence within me. I will meet my wounds with care. I will stop punishing myself for being human." This does not mean we excuse harm. It means we begin where true healing always begins, with mercy. Mercy for the version of us that didn't know better. Mercy for the decisions made in fear. Mercy for the times we were just trying to survive. There is a Zen teaching that says, "The way you do anything is the way you do everything." So start small. Speak gently to yourself when you drop something. Pause before criticizing your reflection. Say thank you to your feet before you sleep. This is not silly. This is sacred, because how we speak to ourselves becomes how we speak to the world, and the world is aching for softness. When we are kind to ourselves, we become safe people for others. When we are patient with our own healing, we become healers in our communities. Let this be your daily vow. I will not abandon myself. Not today, not anymore. You are not too old to be gentle. You are not too late to begin again. You are not too broken to be whole. And the soft answer, it begins now, with a breath, with a whisper, with a hand over your heart that says, "I am here. And I am worthy of love, always." Chapter 10, The Gentle Legacy, Leaving Behind Light in a World That Forgets. We all wonder at one point or another what we will leave behind. Not the money, not the titles, not the possessions neatly labeled and stored in boxes, but the essence, the echo. The unseen fingerprints we press into the lives of those we love. In Buddhism, this is the question of legacy, not as an ego-driven achievement, but as a reflection of our lived compassion. The ripple we set into motion with each word, each act, each moment of presence. It is not how loudly we lived, but how deeply we touched. As we step into the later seasons of life, the temptation to look back with regret can be strong. We wonder if we did enough, if we mattered, if anyone will remember us when the house is quiet, the phone doesn't ring, and the calendar is blank. But here is the Dharma's truth. You do not have to be remembered to have made a difference. You only have to love, and that love lives on, whether or not your name does. Let me share the story of Grace, a hospice volunteer in her mid-80s who once told me, "I used to think I had to do something big with my life. Now I know that sitting quietly beside someone in pain without trying to fix it is the biggest thing I've ever done." Grace was not famous. She had no children, no published books. But every Sunday for the past 14 years, she showed up to the hospice center with a pot of tea and a warm scarf. She would sit beside the dying, offering her silence, her attention, and her smile. She didn't tell them to be brave. She didn't try to cheer them up, she simply witnessed them. And in doing so, she offered what the Buddha called the highest gift, presence. In the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha says, just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life. That spiritual life isn't about rituals or robes, it's about how we carry our attention, how we offer our listening, how we walk into a room and bring peace with us. So ask yourself, what is the emotional footprint I leave behind? Do I leave behind the memory of someone who truly listened? Do I leave behind laughter, gentleness, dignity? Did I teach someone to be less afraid of their own heart? These are not small questions, they are legacy. We often think legacy requires a monument, but perhaps legacy is more like wind through trees, invisible but deeply felt. I remember a woman named Tyne who raised 5 children while working 2 jobs. She never traveled far, never took a vacation, but her children grew up kind, resilient, and deeply grounded. One of her daughters once said to me, "My mother taught me to pray not with words, but with the way she made soup." That is legacy, to stir rice with mindfulness, to fold laundry with reverence, to say, "I forgive you," even when your voice trembles, and perhaps most of all, to leave behind a trace of stillness in a world that spins too fast. If you're reading this and wondering if your life mattered, it does. If you're afraid it's too late to pass on something meaningful, it's not. Every smile you give, every boundary you gently hold, every time you choose patience over panic, that is the inheritance, that is the teaching. You do not need a podium. You only need presence. You do not need perfection. You only need your honest heart. The Buddha did not ask his followers to be remembered. He asked them to be awake. Let this be your prayer as the sun sets on your day, your season, your life. May I live in such a way that those who meet me feel closer to their own goodness. That is the gentle legacy, not carved in stone, but planted in hearts, not archived in books, but carried in breath. You do not disappear. You dissolve into kindness, and long after your name is spoken for the last time, that kindness remains, still glowing, still guiding, still yours. If you've made it this far, then something inside you is already awakening. And maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to rewrite the story you whisper to yourself, not with grand gestures or perfect answers, but with small mercies. A softer voice, a slower breath. The Buddha never asked us to become legends. He only asked us to wake up, to meet each moment with clarity, with care, with love. So perhaps your greatest gift won't be in what you accomplish, but in how deeply you witness others. How honestly you sit with your own heart, how gently you walk through the rest of your days, leaving behind something no storm can wash away, the memory of your presence. That is the legacy worth living. And if this journey moved you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Tell someone, share the feeling. Leave a comment not just for us, but for the next person wandering through the same questions you've faced. Subscribe so we can keep building this quiet circle of clarity and kindness. You may never know the lives you've touched simply by being here, but I promise you they are many. Thank you for walking beside us today. May you carry what you've learned into the spaces that matter most, and may the rest of your life unfold like a blessing, one gentle breath at a time.